quill scratched across parchment like a blade carving into flesh. Each stroke sealed a fate that neither love nor mercy could unwrite. The great chandelier above Waverley Manor glowed faintly, its light catching the glint of rain as it battered against the tall windows. Thunder rolled in the distance, slow, deliberate, like the echo of something divine disapproving. Lord Alaric Ravenshire, known in London's whispered circles as the Iron Duke, leaned back in his chair, his expression carved from stone. His black hair, just beginning to gray at the temples, gleamed beneath the candlelight. He looked every inch the aristocrat, polished, poised, and utterly heartless. Before him lay a contract that was not merely financial, it was matrimonial. A sale written in ink instead of blood. Across from him stood Mr. Harland, the merchant whose fortunes were as vast as his pride. The man smiled, the way men smile when they have just sold something priceless and know it. "You will find my daughter obedient, my lord," he said, his voice oily with triumph. "She is educated, polite, and entirely unspoiled by ambition." The Duke didn't look up. "Ambition," he murmured, "isn't the concern of a wife." His voice was low, calm, and yet sharp enough to draw silence. In the corner, partially hidden by shadow, Isabel Harland stood like a statue waiting to be auctioned. She wore a gown of pale silver that shimmered faintly each time lightning flared beyond the windows. Her hands were clasped before her, the knuckles white with restraint. Every so often, her eyes flicked to the man who would become her husband, and every time she found no flicker of emotion in his. The Duke reached for the quill. His fingers brushed the ink, steady, deliberate. "This is not a union of affection," he said without looking at her. "It is an arrangement of necessity. Do you understand that, Miss Harland?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to answer with the truth, that she understood too well, that she was merely another coin traded between powerful men, but something in her refused to let him have that satisfaction. Lifting her chin slightly, she replied, "Yes, Your Grace, I understand it perfectly." He glanced up at her then, for the briefest moment, and something passed between them, not warmth, not sympathy, but recognition, as if each saw in the other a mirror of quiet resignation. The contract was signed, the ink glistened wetly, a dark river of permanence. The merchant laughed, a sound far too loud for the suffocating room. "Well then, my Isabel, the Duchess of Ravenshire." Isabel's lips parted in surprise. The title felt foreign, like a crown made of glass. The Duke did not rise, nor smile, nor offer his hand. He merely folded the document, pressed his seal into the wax, and said coldly, "You may leave us, Mr. Harland." Her father hesitated, sensing something in the air he could not name, something colder than arrogance. But the Duke's tone left no room for negotiation. Within moments, the carriage wheels were heard again, fading into the rain. Silence filled the hall. Only the fire dared breathe. At last, Alaric stood. "I imagine you have questions," he said, his back turned toward her. "I have none, Your Grace," Isabel answered quietly. "I know my place." He turned then, slowly. His eyes, a piercing, storm-washed gray, studied her with an intensity that made her heart falter. "Do you?" he asked. The air between them seemed to pulse. Isabel's courage trembled but did not fail. "I am your wife by paper," she said, "but I am still myself by will. If I must live in this house as a stranger, so be it. But I will not live as a ghost." A flicker, just one, crossed his expression, perhaps surprise, perhaps something deeper. Then it vanished. "Ghosts," he murmured, turning back toward the window, "are all that live in this house." Outside, lightning flashed. The crest of Ravenshire glinted above the mantel, a raven holding a crown in its beak, wings spread as if ready to flee. And as Isabel stood in that grand, suffocating chamber, she realized that her new husband had not merely built a fortune upon contracts. He had built walls, tall, unyielding, and haunted by something far more binding than any signature. But she also realized something else, something the Duke did not yet know. Even the coldest contracts could be undone, not by ink nor by law, but by a single tear. The carriage wheels rolled through a sea of fog, carrying Isabel Harland, now Duchess Ravenshire, toward her new prison of stone. Dawn crept pale and reluctant over the cliffs, painting the horizon in gray hues that bled into the sea. Ravenshire Hall emerged from the mist like a creature waking from centuries of slumber, tall spires, blackened windows, and ivy crawling like veins across its weathered walls. The driver slowed, glancing once at his passenger through the glass panel. "We've arrived, Your Grace," he muttered, though his voice carried more pity than reverence. Isabel stepped out, her gloved hand trembling slightly as her boots sank into the gravel. The air was sharp with salt and cold. Each breath stung like a warning. Before her, the great iron gates loomed, bearing the Ravenshire crest, a raven clutching a broken crown, wings outstretched against the storm. It wasn't the home of a man, it was the fortress of a memory. Inside, silence reigned. The grand entrance was lined with portraits, somber figures watching her every move. Their eyes, though painted centuries ago, seemed alive, as if whispering, "You don't belong here." From the far end of the corridor came the soft shuffle of steps. A woman emerged, tall and severe, with silver hair tucked neatly beneath a black lace cap. "I'm Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper," she said with a curtsy that was more duty than welcome. "His Grace has retired to his study. You'll not disturb him unless summoned." Isabel nodded. "Of course." Mrs. Vale studied her for a moment, her sharp eyes flickering with something unreadable. "If I may advise, my lady, keep to the west wing. The east has been locked for years." "Why?" The housekeeper's gaze drifted briefly toward the shadowed hallway. "Because some doors once opened invite back what should remain buried." Isabel felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the way Mrs. Vale said it. She followed the woman up the marble staircase, her steps echoing faintly. The air smelled faintly of dust, wax, and roses, long dead. The corridors seemed endless, their candle sconces barely keeping the darkness at bay. Every so often, she caught glimpses of the outside world through tall windows, the gray sea crashing against black cliffs far below. When at last they reached her chambers, Mrs. Vale opened the door and gestured inside. "His Grace ordered these rooms prepared for you. If you require anything, ring the bell. Supper is served at 7, though he often dines alone." Alone. The word lingered like a ghost in the air. After the door closed, Isabel exhaled and looked around. The room was beautiful, yet lifeless, a gilded cage of silk and emptiness. The fireplace burned low, casting trembling shadows on the walls. On the vanity rested a single rose, perfectly preserved in glass. A small tag beneath it read, "For Celeste." The name sent a ripple through her. Who was Celeste? That evening, she changed into a gown of muted blue and descended for supper. The long dining table stretched like an ocean between them, Alaric at one end, Isabel at the other. Silver gleamed. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. He ate little, she ate less. "Was your journey tolerable?" he asked finally, his voice low but even. "Yes, Your Grace." A pause. "You may call me Alaric when necessary." "When necessary," she echoed softly. He looked up then, meeting her gaze for the first time since the ceremony. There was something in his eyes, not cruelty, but weariness so deep it bordered on despair. "You need not pretend affection," he said flatly. "We both know what this arrangement is," her fork stilled. "And what if I do not wish to pretend?" His brow furrowed slightly. "You would rather live without illusion?" "I would rather live with honesty." He studied her for a moment, then gave a faint, humorless smile. "Then you will find Ravenshire an honest place. It offers nothing it cannot keep." Dinner ended in silence. When she rose to leave, his voice followed her, quiet, almost reluctant. "Mrs. Vale will show you the library in the morning. It may be the only room here that remembers what warmth feels like." She paused at the door, glancing back. "Does anyone else?" He didn't answer. Later, in her chamber, Isabel sat by the window, watching lightning split the sky. The sea roared below, wild and endless. Somewhere in the east wing, a door creaked though no one was there. And as she clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, she whispered to herself, "A bride in chains, yes, but even chains rust in time." The wind howled in response, as though the house itself had heard her promise. The next evening came draped in rain. The storm had returned, hammering the manor's tall windows with merciless rhythm, as if the heavens themselves were demanding entry. The great dining hall glowed faintly under the shimmer of candelabras, but the warmth failed to reach the far corners. The fire crackled in protest, its light flickering against the rows of portraits that lined the walls, generations of Ravenshires staring down, stern and watchful. At the far end of the table sat the Duke. Alaric's posture was perfect, his hands steady, his gaze fixed on nothing. The candlelight gilded his face, carving his features in shadow and flame. He looked like a man both alive and entombed, his elegance a mask, his silence a fortress. Isabel entered quietly. Her gown tonight was ivory, simple but dignified, her hair pinned with small pearls. She had expected nothing from this dinner, not conversation, not companionship, but she refused to be invisible. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said softly, her voice steady despite the echo that followed it. He inclined his head slightly. "Good evening." A servant pulled out her chair. The scent of roasted duck, herbs, and wine lingered in the air, but the tension at the table was stronger, like iron beneath silk. She unfolded her napkin with slow grace and began to eat, aware of his every breath, every pause. Minutes passed in brittle quiet. The only sound was the delicate clink of silver on porcelain and the faraway thunder rolling over the cliffs. Finally, Isabel spoke. "I noticed the garden today," she began. "It's beautiful in its sadness. The roses still bloom, even though no one tends to them." The Duke did not look up. "They grow wild, like most things left without purpose." "Perhaps that is their purpose," she countered softly, "to grow despite neglect." His fork paused mid-air. For a fraction of a second she saw it, a flicker in his eyes, something uncertain. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. "You speak poetically, Duchess," he murmured, "but poetry does not thrive in this house, only silence does." "Silence," she said, "is not the same as peace." That made him look at her. His gaze met hers fully for the first time, and Isabel felt it, that strange pull, heavy with sorrow and something unspoken. His eyes were gray, the color of storms waiting to break. "Tell me," he said quietly, "do you always answer so boldly?" "Only when I feel I've been spoken to as though I were invisible," she replied, her tone even but not unkind. A faint smirk curved at the corner of his lips, not of mockery but disbelief. "You mistake distance for cruelty." "Perhaps," she admitted, "but even distance can wound if it is sharp enough." The conversation ended there, but the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was alive, heavy, fragile, shifting like the air before thunder. As the meal drew on, Isabel noticed something small but strange. The Duke barely ate. He would cut his food meticulously, take a sip of wine, and then stare into the fire as though trying to remember what hunger felt like. When she mentioned her mother's fondness for music, his hand froze mid-motion. The silver fork trembled. "Music," he said, his voice hoarse, "is forbidden in Ravenshire." "Forbidden?" she echoed softly. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the flames. This house was built upon it and destroyed by it. Before she could ask more, he rose abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. His napkin fell from his hand, forgotten. "If you have need of anything, Mrs. Vale will see to it. Good night, Duchess." Alaric. But he was already gone, the echo of his footsteps vanishing into the corridors. Isabel sat alone at the massive table, the fire crackling weakly. For a long moment she stared at his untouched glass of wine. A single droplet clung to the rim, glinting in the candlelight. Then, as she leaned closer, she saw it wasn't wine at all. It was a tear. Her heart tightened. The Iron Duke, the man who married her for a ledger, had cried silently at his own table. Outside, the wind howled against the glass and the storm raged on. But inside, beneath the weight of that single tear, something within Isabel shifted. Pity, yes, but also defiance. For the first time, she didn't see him as a monster. She saw him as a man drowning behind the walls he'd built, and she whispered to the empty room, "If this house forbids warmth, then I shall bring it." The chandelier trembled as thunder cracked, as if the manor itself had heard her vow. It was near midnight when Isabel first heard the whispers. The manor had long fallen silent. Even the sea outside seemed to hold its breath. Only the faint groan of the old timbers and the occasional rustle of wind through the shutters broke the stillness. Isabel, unable to sleep, rose from her bed and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. The fire in her chamber had died hours ago, leaving only embers that pulsed like a dying heartbeat. She stepped into the corridor. The air there was colder, heavier, as if the house itself was alive, watching. Her slippered feet made no sound on the carpet as she moved toward the main stair. Then, just beyond the turn in the hall, she heard voices, low, hurried, anxious. "The claws, Mrs. Vale," a man's voice murmured. It was the steward, Mr. Finch, his tone clipped and uneasy. "Keep your voice down," came the housekeeper's sharp whisper. "Walls here have ears." "I don't see why it should be a secret. The Duke signed that contract in name honor. Front of the merchant himself. A year, that's what it said. 1 year to produce an heir, or the estate passes back to the Harlan's control." Isabel froze. The candle in her hand flickered violently. Her heart seemed to stop, then start again in painful rhythm. "Careful, Finch," Mrs. Vale hissed. "If His Grace hears you, I've served him long enough to know he doesn't care about gossip," Finch muttered bitterly. But that poor girl. Isabel didn't stay to hear the rest. She turned and slipped back into the shadows, her mind spinning. The words echoed like a curse in her skull. 1 year, an heir, control. So that was it. Her father hadn't sold her for alliance or reputation. He'd sold her womb. Her husband hadn't married her for companionship. He'd purchased survival. Her chest tightened with fury, humiliation, and something deeper, grief perhaps for the illusion she'd foolishly tried to build. She returned to her chamber, shut the door quietly, and leaned against it. Her reflection in the mirror caught her eye, pale, shaken, but not broken. "A contract," she whispered to herself. "That's all I am." But then her gaze shifted to the rose under glass on her vanity. For Celeste. And something inside her hardened, not with despair, but with resolve. If she was to be treated as a transaction, then she would rewrite the terms. The next morning, she entered the breakfast room with poise instead of fear. The Duke looked up briefly from his newspaper, the faintest hint of surprise flickering in his eyes. She wore a gown of deep green, the color of living things, a defiance against the manor's grays and blacks. "You're awake early," he said, his tone carefully indifferent. "I've always believed the day is what you make of it," she replied. "I plan to make something of mine." He studied her quietly. "Do as you wish," he said finally, though the words carried less indifference than before. She curtsied lightly and turned to the window, her gaze on the garden below. The morning mist lay over the roses like a shroud. "Your garden is beautiful, Your Grace," she said. "It only needs care." His voice was flat. "It's been dead for years. Then I'll bring it back." He looked at her, not as a husband looks at a wife, but as a man startled by something he doesn't understand. "Why would you trouble yourself with something so pointless?" "Because," she said softly, "beauty does not ask permission to live again." Their eyes met, and for a brief, unguarded instant, he seemed to falter. Then he turned away sharply. "As you wish, Duchess. Just do not disturb the East Wing." The East Wing again. The forbidden hall that no servant entered, the one Mrs. Vale warned her against. Isabel said nothing, but the name Celeste pulsed in her mind like an unanswered question. That afternoon, she went into the garden. The soil was rough and choked with weeds, but beneath the decay, she saw green, stubborn, persistent green. As her fingers dug into the dirt, the wind rose, carrying faint notes of the sea. Behind her, unseen, a figure stood at the library window, the Duke, watching in silence. For reasons he could not explain, he didn't call her back inside. That night, Isabel sat by the window again, her hands sore but her spirit strangely alive. She thought of the contract, of ink and greed, and the coldness of men who bartered affection like property. And then she whispered to the dark, "You think you've bought my life, Alaric Ravenshire, but love isn't part of your ledger." Thunder rumbled, deep and distant, like laughter from the heavens themselves. The game had begun. The following week unfolded beneath a restless sky. The wind swept endlessly across the cliffs, carrying salt and sorrow, while Ravensshire Hall stood unmoved, ancient and brooding against the changing weather. Yet within its walls, something had begun to shift, almost imperceptibly. Each morning, Isabel walked to the garden with her gloves and shears, and each morning a few more weeds gave way to color. The roses, stubborn and scarred from years of neglect, began to lift their faces to the sun once more. The gardeners watched her in quiet disbelief. No mistress of the manor had stepped foot there since the day she died. The Duke's shadow sometimes flickered in the windows above, unseen yet ever present. He told himself he did not care, but he watched all the same. It was on the 5th morning that Isabel found it. The mist had just begun to thin when her shears caught on something hard beneath the overgrowth, a shape buried under thorns. She knelt and brushed away the vines until her fingers touched cool marble. Slowly, she revealed what lay hidden, a statue of a woman, delicate and mournful, her face tilted toward the heavens, one arm reaching as though in farewell. At the statue's base was a single inscription carved deep into the stone: "To my dearest Celeste, my heart, my sin, my silence." Isabel froze. Celeste. The name on the rose in her room, the name spoken by no one, yet felt in every cold breath of this manor. "Who were you?" she whispered. Her voice trembled, caught between reverence and sorrow. A sudden gust rushed through the garden, scattering petals across the ground. For a fleeting second, she thought she heard something, a hum, faint as a sigh, music, a single note, low and soft, carried by the wind. Then silence. She turned sharply, but no one was there, only the whisper of the sea and the creak of old branches. Later that evening, unable to quiet her thoughts, Isabel approached Mrs. Vale in the corridor. "Tell me about Lady Celeste," she asked. The housekeeper stiffened, her face paling slightly. "You should not speak that name, my lady. It brings nothing but unrest." "Was she the Duke's wife?" "No." Mrs. Vale's gaze flicked toward the East Wing. "She was his intended. They were to be married when tragedy struck." "What kind of tragedy?" The woman hesitated. "The kind that leaves a man who once played the violin unable to bear the sound of a song." Isabel's breath caught. "She died?" Mrs. Vale's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "She drowned in the lake behind the manor, on a night not unlike this one. The storm took her, or so his Grace believes. Since then, that wing has remained locked. It was hers." A thousand thoughts raced through Isabel's mind: the forbidden wing, the preserved rose, his hatred for music, his silence at dinner. The house was not just haunted by grief. It was grief. Every wall, every corridor, every breath of wind carried Celeste's name. That night, unable to rest, she walked the halls again. The candles flickered as she passed, their flames bending as though drawn to her. She stopped at the end of the east corridor, where the double doors stood closed and veiled in dust. The keyhole gleamed faintly in the moonlight. "Forgive me," she whispered to whatever spirit lingered beyond, "but I cannot heal what I do not understand." Her hand hovered near the handle, trembling. Before she could touch it, a deep voice echoed down the hall. "Step away from that door." She turned, and there he was. The Duke, standing in the half-light, his eyes hard, his voice cold enough to still the air itself. "You will not enter that room," he said, striding closer. "Ever." "I didn't mean—" His tone sharpened. "You presume curiosity is a virtue, Duchess. It isn't. Not here." She lifted her chin. "Then why leave it unlocked?" He stopped short. The silence between them was electric. For a moment the mask slipped, not anger now, but pain. "Because," he said at last, voice breaking like glass, "locking it doesn't keep her from haunting me." The air between them thickened. She wanted to reach for him, to say something, anything, but he turned away before she could speak. The next sound she heard was the echo of his footsteps fading into the dark. Isabel stood there a long time after, her hand pressed to her heart. The ghost she had expected to find was not in the East Wing at all. It was in him. The storm returned 3 nights later, darker and angrier than before. It swept across the cliffs with a fury that made even the old walls of Ravensshire groan. The rain lashed against the windows in wild torrents, and the lightning tore the sky open like a wound. Isabel couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the corridors like an unquiet spirit, and every creak of the manor seemed to whisper her name. She rose from her bed, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and lit a candle. Something in her heart tugged her toward the library. The door was ajar. Inside, shadows stretched long across the walls, broken only by the dim glow of the fireplace. And there, seated before it, a glass in hand and papers scattered across the floor, was the Duke. His coat hung loosely off one shoulder, his hair disheveled, his composure shattered. He didn't look up when she entered. "Is the house not large enough for you to avoid me, Duchess?" His voice was hoarse, weary, not sharp, but defeated. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly, stepping closer. The storm, he echoed bitterly, has impeccable timing." He tossed a letter into the fire. It curled and blackened, the wax seal melting into nothing. "That," he said, "was from your father." She frowned. "My father?" He laughed, a low, humorless sound. "Yes. He reminds me that time is running out, that his investment must yield results, that if no heir is produced within the year, Ravenshire will return to Harland ownership. His words, not mine." The candlelight trembled between them. Isabel felt her stomach twist. "And you," she said carefully, "what do you think of such terms?" His gaze lifted to hers, and for the first time, it wasn't guarded. It was wounded. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have made my life nothing but a chain of bargains. Every piece of me was sold long ago. I only wonder which part of me was left to sign the last one." The storm roared outside. The thunder cracked through the silence between them. He turned his face away, his voice breaking. "You should hate me for it. You have every reason to." Isabel took a hesitant step closer. "I don't hate you, Alaric." That made him look up. His eyes glimmered faintly in the firelight, gray as the sea, sharp as sorrow. "You should," she shook her head. "I pity you." He flinched as though struck. "Do not pity me." "Then stop giving me reasons to." The air tightened, their eyes locked, his filled with anger he couldn't sustain, hers calm with compassion he couldn't comprehend. "I read about your fiancée," she said quietly. "Celeste." His entire body went still. The storm outside seemed to pause with him. "Who told you?" he asked, his voice dangerous in its quiet. "No one," she said. "I found her name, the rose, the statue in the garden, the pain in every room of this house. She's everywhere." He rose abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You know nothing of her." "Then tell me." His jaw clenched, his hands trembled. For a long moment he said nothing, and then, as the thunder cracked once more, he broke. "She was music," he said, his voice shaking. "She was light. She believed she could save me from my father's shadow, from my own ambition. But love doesn't cure what grief infects." He poured another glass of brandy, his hands unsteady. "The night she died, I told her I couldn't attend the engagement ball she wanted so badly. I was too consumed with debts, with appearances, with everything that didn't matter. She went, alone. The carriage overturned on the cliff road. They said she drowned before help arrived." He turned away, his shoulders rigid, his voice cracking into something almost childlike. "They found her hands still clutching the music she played for me that morning. Her fingers." He stopped, unable to finish. "Since that day I cannot bear the sound of a note. Every melody sounds like her last breath." Isabel stepped forward slowly. Her heart ached for him, for the hollow in his voice where love used to live. She set her candle down and laid a hand on his shoulder. For a heartbeat, he froze. Then, to her shock, he didn't move away. His head dropped, and the mask that had held his face together for years finally fractured. "I married you to keep this house," he whispered, "but the moment you spoke of hope, I realized what I had lost was never the estate. It was the man I used to be." She didn't speak. She simply stood beside him as the firelight flickered over their faces, two broken souls illuminated by the same pain. And when his first tear fell, it landed not on the contract burning in the fire, but on her hand. The mask of the Iron Duke had cracked, and through it a human heart began to breathe again. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the world washed in silver. The manor lay draped in a quiet that wasn't peace, but exhaustion. The rain had rinsed the sky clean, yet inside Ravenshire Hall, everything still trembled from the night before. Isabel woke to the smell of smoke. The embers in the library hearth had died down to gray ash, and the faint scent of burnt parchment lingered in the air. When she stepped into the hall, she found the Duke sitting by the tall window at the end of the corridor, still in the same clothes, his shirt open at the throat, his cravat loosened, the weight of years clinging to him like chains. He didn't turn when she approached, but he spoke as if he had felt her there. "You should not have stayed," he murmured. "No one ever stays when I show them who I am." "Then you've known the wrong people," she said softly. At that he turned. The light of early morning cut across his face, catching the tired creases at his eyes, the streak of silver at his temples, the scar along his jaw, a scar that looked less like a mark of war and more like one left by grief. "Isabel," he said, her name barely a whisper, "you are a stranger in a house that devours happiness. You were never meant to suffer here." "And yet," she replied, "I have." He blinked, surprised, almost hurt. "But I've also learned," she continued, "about you, about this house, about the woman you loved." His jaw tightened, but the anger didn't come. Instead, his eyes softened and his voice lost its edge. "You think me a monster for it, don't you? I think you're a man who's forgotten what it means to forgive himself." He laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that breaks more than it mends. "Forgive myself?" he repeated. "You don't understand, Isabel. I don't deserve it." "Then explain," she said gently. "Help me understand." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as though he were trying to find any trace of judgment, and finding none. Then, at last, he spoke. "When I was young," he began, his voice low, "I loved my father's estate more than my own soul. I believed I could restore our family's honor, that money, marriage, and influence could rebuild what time had destroyed. Celeste, she saw through that. She wanted me, not my name, not my ambition. She told me once that love wasn't ownership, it was willingness. I didn't listen." He looked down at his hands, calloused where a nobleman's shouldn't be. "When she died, I swore I would never let love weaken me again. So I made every decision after that with my heart locked away. Every letter, every signature, every contract, another wall between myself and feeling." He met her gaze again, and for a moment she saw the boy he must have once been, hopeful, earnest, human. "I thought I could bargain my way through life," he said. "That if I could control everything, people, fortunes, even fate, I would never feel that kind of loss again. But it seems grief doesn't honor contracts. It collects its debts whenever it pleases." Isabel stepped closer, the faint scent of roses clinging to her gown. "And now," she asked, "do you still believe you can buy silence?" He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "because you walked into this house and refused to be bought." Their eyes held, the air between them fragile, trembling, alive. "You tend to the garden as if it were a grave," he said quietly. "Why?" "Because it isn't a grave," she answered. "It's proof that even what's buried can bloom again." The words hit him harder than any confession. He stood, and the space between them vanished. His hand lifted, hesitated, then fell to his side again. "I don't know how to speak to you," he said honestly, "not without ruining everything I've built." "Then ruin it," she whispered. Silence. Only the sea beyond the cliffs, breathing in and out like a heartbeat. For the first time since Celeste's death, Alaric Ravenshire did what no man of pride or title was supposed to do. He let his walls fall. He spoke of the nightmares that woke him, of hearing the echo of her song in every storm, of seeing her reflection in every candle's flicker. He told her of the guilt that had carved him hollow, of the ache that no amount of wealth could silence. And through it all, Isabel said nothing. She simply listened, not as a wife fulfilling duty, but as a soul answering another's pain. When his voice finally broke, she reached out and took his hand, not timidly, but with quiet certainty. His fingers curled around hers as though afraid. She might vanish too. And in that moment, something irreversible happened. The Duke stopped speaking like a man who had lost his heart and began breathing like one who had just found it again. The morning her father returned, the sun dared to shine again over Ravenshire. It poured through the tall, arched windows, glinting off the marble floors, painting the hall in gold, light falling upon a house that had forgotten how to welcome it. But beneath that light, tension moved like an unseen storm. Mr. Harlan's carriage arrived with thunderous pride. The coat of arms, the golden lion of the Harlans, gleamed arrogantly on its door. When he stepped out, his boots crunched on the gravel with the weight of ownership. He did not look at the manor with reverence, only calculation. "Ravenshire," he muttered. "Sooner or later, every name bends to coin." Isabel stood at the top of the stairs, her gown pale blue, her spine unbroken. The moment her father's eyes met hers, she felt the sharpness of that old, familiar chill, the look of a man who measured affection by profit. "My dear," he said with feigned warmth, ascending the steps, "you look well. Married life agrees with you, I see." "It doesn't," she replied simply. He frowned. "Then at least it's profitable." Before she could respond, Alaric entered the hall. He looked immaculate, the Iron Duke once more, but something had changed. His composure was still, but it no longer concealed emptiness. It concealed resolve. His gaze met hers briefly, then turned to Harland. "Mr. Harland," he said, "you arrive uninvited." The merchant smiled thinly. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but my visit is necessary. I've come to discuss our contract." The word hit the air like poison. Alaric gestured toward the study. "Then let's end it properly." They entered the grand room where it had all begun. The same fire crackling, the same desk upon which her future had been signed away. But this time, the man who stood behind it was not the one who had bartered a bride. Harland placed a fresh document on the table. "The year draws close. My daughter's duty remains unfulfilled. Unless an heir is on the way, I must reclaim what was pledged, the estate and its titles." Isabel's face went pale, but Alaric did not flinch. "You will take nothing from me," he said calmly. The merchant sneered. "You signed your word, Ravenshire. You owe me everything you own." The Duke's hand came down on the table, not in anger, but in finality. "I owe you nothing." "Watch your tone," Harland snapped. "I could have you ruined." Alaric leaned forward, his voice low, dangerous but steady. "You already ruined me the day I let your greed decide my marriage." He lifted the parchment, the one that had shackled them both, and held it over the fire. "Don't," Harland hissed. "You're a fool if you think you can burn debt." Alaric looked to Isabel. His eyes met hers across the room, and in them she saw everything he had never said aloud. "Thank you, forgive me. I choose you." Then he dropped the paper into the flames. The wax seal melted, the ink bled and curled, the contract twisting into smoke that rose like the ghost of everything false between them. Her father lunged forward. "You madman! That was your salvation!" "No," Alaric said quietly, watching the ashes fall. "That was my prison." The fire flared high, licking at the edges of the grate. The smell of burnt parchment filled the air, the scent of freedom disguised as ruin. Harland turned on his daughter. "Do you know what you've done, Isabel? You've destroyed your future." She met his gaze without fear. "No, father. For the first time, I've chosen it." Her father's mouth twisted. "He'll cast you aside once the gold runs out. You'll come crawling back." "Enough!" Alaric's voice thundered through the room, calm but unyielding. "You will not speak to her again." The merchant scoffed. "You'll regret this, Ravenshire. She's no duchess. She's a debt you can't repay." But the Duke stepped forward, his eyes fierce with truth. "You're wrong. She's the only thing in this house that isn't owed." For the first time, Harland faltered, not because he feared Alaric's wealth, but because he saw something he could not buy. Conviction. He turned on his heel, his coat swirling behind him like a closing curtain. "So be it," he spat. "Ravenshire will fall, and you with it." When the carriage wheels finally vanished down the cliff road, silence filled the hall once more. Isabel stood beside the hearth, her hands trembling. "You burned everything," she whispered. "Yes," Alaric said, stepping closer. His voice softened. "Everything that kept me from you." His eyes glimmered in the firelight. "The contract was never worth what your kindness gave me." "And what is that, Your Grace?" she asked softly. He smiled, not coldly, not bitterly, but as though smiling for the first time in years. Peace. For a moment they stood there in silence, the fire between them no longer a wall, but a bridge. And when he reached out this time, she didn't hesitate. Their hands met over the dying flames, two souls once bound by ink, now joined by choice. 3 days later, Ravenshire Hall fell silent again, but this time not from grief, from absence. The servants whispered that the estate would soon belong to no one. Debtors came and went like vultures circling a dying beast. Notices were delivered by men with cold eyes and ink-stained hands. The great house that had stood for centuries under the Ravenshire crest now stood on the edge of ruin. Alaric Ravenshire, the Iron Duke, had undone his name with a single act of defiance, a tear in a contract, a vow made from the heart instead of the ledger. When the final creditor left, the grand doctor closed with a sound that echoed through every corridor. Alaric stood in the entryway, looking out at the sea, the light falling softly on his face. He did not look defeated, only free. Isabel approached him quietly, a bundle of folded letters in her hands. "They're all gone," she said. "The servants have taken what little wages they could." Mrs. Vale left the keys on the table. He turned to her, his eyes calm despite the weight that hung over them. "Then it's just us now," she nodded. "Just us." The silence that followed was strangely tender. There was no fear in it, only truth. He exhaled, almost laughing. "Do you know, Isabel, I spent my whole life terrified of losing this place, and now that it's gone, I feel lighter than I have in years." She smiled faintly. "That's because what you feared losing was never your home. It was your past." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened completely. "You speak as though you were born here," he murmured. "I might as well have been," she said quietly. "I've lived every day of my life in someone else's shadow, yours, my father's, the world's. But here I found my own." He reached out, brushing his fingers against her cheek. The touch was hesitant, reverent. "And now you'll leave all this behind? The title, the comfort, the name?" She met his gaze, steady and sure. "If I have you beside me, Alaric, I have all the comfort I'll ever need." For the first time in years, he let himself laugh, a real laugh, quiet and full of wonder. "Then we leave together." By dusk, the carriage was ready, a simple one this time, no crest, no banners. Just a pair of horses, the road, and the open horizon. As they rode away from Ravenshire Hall, Isabel looked back once. The manor stood bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun, its great windows glinting like eyes that finally wept. Smoke from the chimneys curled lazily upward, not the smoke of ruin, but of release. The Duke's hand rested gently over hers. "I thought I'd feel shame," he said softly, "but all I feel is peace." "You've traded walls for sky," she replied. "No one should mourn that." They stopped at the cliffs before leaving the estate grounds. The wind carried the faint scent of the sea, sharp and clean. From here, Ravenshire looked smaller, a memory instead of a prison. Isabel stepped out of the carriage and stood by the edge, the waves roaring below. Alaric joined her, his coat brushing against hers. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "If I still had that contract, I'd burn it again." The wind tangled her hair. She laughed softly, eyes glimmering. "Then promise me one thing, Alaric. Anything. Never build walls again. Not between us, not within yourself." He smiled, faint, genuine, touched by sunlight. "I promise." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a half-burned scrap of parchment. She recognized the signature at once, his next to hers from their marriage contract. Only the top line remained legible. "In the presence of witness, this union shall stand." He handed it to her. "We've lost everything the world values," he said, "but this part, this is still true." She took it gently, then tore it in half. "No," she whispered. "It was true. Now we'll write our own." And as the torn pieces fluttered into the wind, carried toward the sea, the last of their old lives vanished. They stood together, silent, watching the horizon glow. Behind them, Ravenshire Hall began to fade into the dusk, not as a symbol of failure, but of freedom reclaimed. In the golden light, with the world ahead of them and nothing left to lose, the Iron Duke smiled at the woman who had undone him completely and made him whole again. Spring arrived gently that year, not as a roar, but as a whisper. The world thawed slowly, as if cautious of waking the ghosts it had buried beneath winter's snow. Far from Ravenshire, nestled in a valley of wild lavender and golden fields, stood a modest cottage with ivy curling along its stone walls. A stream ran behind it, singing the kind of tune only peace could compose. Smoke drifted from its chimney, curling upward like a prayer finally answered. Inside, laughter lived again. Isabel Ravenshire, though she no longer used the title, stood by the open window, sunlight glancing off her hair as she kneaded bread with hands that once trembled under jeweled rings. Her dress was plain linen now, her sleeves rolled up, her cheeks flushed from warmth rather than worry. The rhythm of her work, the quiet hum of her song, felt like the heartbeat of a home built not on inheritance, but on love earned. Behind her, Alaric, no longer the Duke, but simply Alaric, was splitting wood outside, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. The morning light gilded his hair, and though the scar on his temple remained, it no longer seemed like a wound. It had become part of the story, a mark of the man who had chosen love over legacy. When he entered the cottage, he paused at the doorway, watching her. She looked up and smiled, and it was as if the years of loneliness had never existed. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly, hanging his coat on the peg. "The hall?" she said, wiping flour from her hands. "No. Do you?" He considered that, then shook his head. "I thought I would. The titles, the power, the sense of control. But it was all noise, wasn't it?" "Noise," she echoed softly. "And silence can be crueler." He crossed the room to her, his hands finding hers. "This," he said, his voice low, "this is the only quiet I ever want." She smiled, and in her eyes was that same courage that once made her challenge his pride, that same light that turned a contract into a promise. They ate breakfast together at the wooden table, eggs, bread, and honey from the neighbor's apiary. Outside, the village children passed by, waving. Isabel waved back. Alaric nodded, his usual stoic demeanor softened by the warmth of belonging. He had begun teaching at the small parish school, helping young boys learn their letters and sums. The villagers had taken to him quickly, not as a duke, but as a man of quiet decency who fixed roofs and carried water when storms came. They called him Mr. Ravenshire, though a few still whispered, "Your Grace with affection." For Isabel, life found her too. She played the piano again, not in grand halls, but in the chapel where her voice could rise without judgment. The children adored her stories, especially the one about a cold-hearted duke who had forgotten how to love until he found his heart in ruin. She always smiled when she told it, because she knew it wasn't a story. It was her life. That evening, as the sun fell over the valley, painting everything gold, Alaric stood by the door watching her play. The melody was familiar. It was the same song she'd hummed the night she first came to Ravenshire, when she'd been only a name on a contract. When the last note faded, she turned to him. "Do you remember this tune?" "I'd forgotten I could," he said, "but it feels like home now." She rose and walked to him, slipping her hand into his. "That's because it is home." He kissed her forehead, then her lips, softly, reverently, like a vow renewed. "I was born a duke," he whispered against her skin, "but I learned to live as your husband." "And I," she murmured, "was married for a price, but I stayed for love." Outside, the first stars began to bloom across the darkening sky. The air smelled of earth and rain and renewal. The past, all its ghosts, regrets, and golden cages, had dissolved into memory. As they stood in the doorway of their cottage, the wind carried laughter from the nearby fields. Isabel leaned her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. Neither spoke. They didn't need to, because some stories don't end with castles or crowns. Some end here, in the quiet of love freely chosen, in a home built by two souls who had nothing left to trade, but everything left to give. And so, the Duke, who once wept over contracts, now smiled beneath the open sky, a man reborn, a heart redeemed, a husband finally at peace.